Hi, welcome. Thanks for joining us on the live stream Palestine and the Future of DSA. My name is Tessa E. I use they, them pronouns, and I am based in Madison, Wisconsin. I'm the co-chair of Madison Area DSA. And also here's Joel. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, definitely. Hey, everybody, my name's Joel Reinstein. I use he, him pronouns. I'm formerly a member of the DSA until this episode happened here in Providence. I work as a labor organizer, and I'm also in the DSA BDS working group.
And then Annie. Annie, would you like to do a brief intro?
Hey friends, my name is Annie. I am a member of River Valley DSA in Western Massachusetts, where I spend most of my time doing union organizing. And I'm also a contributor to Cosmonaut magazine. Some folks are familiar. And I also co-authored the petition for an internationalist DSA, which called on the NPC to revoke the dechartering of the Palestine Solidarity Working Group. And got something like 1,400 signatures.
Yeah. Awesome. I was a happy signer. So thanks for putting that statement together. So yeah, we're gonna kick off. I'm gonna give brief sort of like backgrounds to get us up to date with like what happened in the DSA. And then Joel's going to talk a little bit more about the BDS and Palestine Solidarity Working Group. But if you have questions at any time, feel free to throw those in the chat. And we will answer them and loop back around. So to kick it off, so for those of you who don't know, there was a huge debate inside the DSA about Jamal Bowman last year. So the reason that we're talking about Bowman in the DSA is because he is an endorsed candidate and member of DSA. So there are many, many members of Congress that voted for the Iron Dome funding who are not members of DSA, and we have no democratic relationship with inside our organization. But Jamal Bowman voted for the Iron Dome vote and is a member and endorsed candidate of DSA. So that's why the Madison chapter has done a lot of local organizing with Palestinian groups, co-hosting protests and vigils and those things, and working with those allies to those movements. We couldn't sit there and say, we're part of an organization that's in solidarity with you, but our endorsed national candidates are voting to fund Israel and to bomb Palestine. So on October 30th, Madison DSA put out a statement calling on the NPC to expel Jamal Bowman for violating our political platform as an organization, which is to support BDS and Palestinian solidarity. And since then, throughout the fall and early January, 52 DSA chapters across the country released statements either calling for unendorsement or expulsion or some type of response to this vote, which the NPC categorically ignored and didn't really address the chapter level. This is unprecedented in DSA. Like, we do not have chapters call on the national leadership in large numbers like this to make changes. The chapters that called for expulsion represent 24% of Madison DSA overall membership. So while you may want to dismiss Madison for being a small chapter in the Midwest, 24% of chapters representing DSA membership voted for some type of expulsion or censure of Bowman. That's a huge number. To do it on their own accord, right? No coordinated national campaign took place. This was just chapters stepping up. So the working group was the body that was doing all of the main work, right? They were the ones talking to Bowman staff, pushing this, putting out the political line and the ones that were being followed. But the chapters are standing up because what we want in this organization is democracy, right? We want to follow the political platform that we vote on at convention. And we don't want the NPC to be able to overrule the things that we do at our national convention every 2 years. So that is a big drive from Madison and for myself, is to push for a democratic DSA that follows the political platforms that are voted on at our national convention. that brings us up to the dechartering, which happened in February. So just briefly, I'm going to lay out that the NPC called that the dechartering happened because the BDS working group broke what they called the, oh my goodness, the National Committee criteria and the code of conduct from the social media policy. And I just want to highlight for people that the recommendation that they're referencing was a recommendation brought to convention in August of 2020. The was not voted on by convention. It was just a recommendation. And then the committee, national committee criteria was created in the September, creating the social media contract in February. And that, so the criteria that the working group supposedly broke existed for about 2 weeks before the working group broke it. So where's the time in it? Even if you agree with all of the steps, there's no time and energy put into actually changing this, much less the unequal application of this policy from the BDS working group and Palestinian Solidarity working group to the immigrants' rights working group or the international committee. Like multiple working groups have disagreed politically with the NPC, but what makes the BDS and Palestinian working groups political disagreement different? And I'm going to pass it over to Joel to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, thanks, Tessa, for that great summary. So yeah, as Tessa mentioned, following a pretty serious crisis and controversy in the DSA around the NPC's decision to essentially say that a member of the DSA can support funding for Israeli war crimes and face no consequences whatsoever. Following that crisis, the leadership, the NPC voted by a very slim majority to decharter the working group. And as Tessa mentioned, on the surface, they claimed that this was about the working group spreading, in their words, misinformation and violating DSA's code of conduct about comradely behavior by making, uncomradely accusations. And of course, these were all political criticisms of the DSA's leadership that were made by the working group, essentially criticizing the leadership for, for having no accountability for DSA electeds who support Israeli apartheid. The misinformation claim was absurd on its face. The working group pointed out that Bowman had refused to do anything publicly to reverse his positions opposing BDS, supporting funding for Israeli weapons used to kill Palestinians, and taking propaganda trips to Israel with, anti-Palestinian groups like J Street. He had refused to change any of that publicly. And as recently as I believe March 9th of this year, he stated publicly, like, yeah, I still support Israel's Iron Dome missile defense system, and I still support funding that. And, I would have voted for that again if it hadn't been included in a bill that I didn't want to vote for other reasons. So essentially, he's confirming that nothing's changed, that he's going to continue to support Israeli apartheid. And that was the correct claim that the DSA BDS working group put out publicly, that, that the slim majority on NPC claimed was misinformation. This wasn't about a social media policy. This wasn't about process. This wasn't about any kind of code of conduct. This was pretty obviously retaliation for the BDS working group effectively organizing opposition in the DSA and organizing rank and file DSA members around something that for once was not a factional, was not an inscrutable faction fight involving, cliques or involving who knows who. It was actually a conflict in the organization over socialist principles that galvanized rank and file members. And I think, like Tessa mentioned, something like 52 chapters put out statements throughout this process of fighting for accountability, supporting BDS and supporting the BDS picket line. And then we saw, the petition that Annie helped write, something like 1,400 DSA members signed it, in the space of only a couple weeks. So it's clearly this is something that's important to active DSA members, to the rank and file. It's something that has broad support, and I think that's the reason why this slim majority on the NPC, the sort of conservative faction, wanted to get rid of their opposition. So, I think that's kind of the gist of the summary. There's always lots more to talk about, but I think that it's better when things are simple and clear and actually about political principles, because that's something that every member can be engaged with. That's something that's democratic. And when things get bogged down with a lot of efforts to bring in really obtuse process questions, or other things that kind of make things complicated, and who said what when, that's disempowering for rank and file members. It makes it so that people want to say, well, I don't know about all that because I can't, because who can possibly keep up with it all? And so, this was fundamentally actually about political principles.
Great. We're going to jump over to Annie to talk a little bit about putting together the For Internationalist DSA statement.
Hello, comrades. I'm going to quickly screen share, which hopefully works with the live stream. Someone bug me if it's not. So this is the petition. Like I'd imagine a lot of the folks listening who are semi plugged into DSA but don't necessarily have time to follow things 24/7. I heard about the decision to decharter kind of the day of, and just kind of as one of the rank and file members that Joel mentioned, went home, called a very dear comrade from Rochester DSA, Gene Allen, also Remy Dobbs, of many names. And the two of us worked on drafting this petition and putting it out. And I think something that Joel spoke to that we really tried to get across and embody in this is that this is fundamentally a political question. It's not just a procedural question about what particular roles working groups should have, or like who did or didn't violate what rule, right? Like if there had maybe been like a grievance or a suspension against a specific person, then we could talk about it being more procedural, but fundamentally dissolving our entire structure for doing Palestine solidarity work is a political decision. And something that we really tried to get across in this piece is that historically, Palestine solidarity has been kind of a wedge issue for a whole set of questions around socialist and revolutionary strategy, around nationalism, around the struggle of oppressed peoples and working class people. That has been kind of a litmus test for a lot of incarnations of US left, going back decades. And this issue, like the more you think about it, the more it's not just a question of Palestinian liberation, though it fundamentally is. It also has huge implications for instance, how DSA relates to elected officials. At the last conventions, two separate proposals, one from Tempest and one from the group Marxist Unity, were put forward to advocate for higher accountability and democratic discipline over elected officials, and a more kind of conscious principled electoral strategy, and both failed. And I think at the time, a lot of people saw these proposals in sort of almost administrative or bureaucratic terms, and they were like, oh, like, I don't know if I want to tie my hands that way. Like, we can just let our politicians do what they want and we'll do what we want. They didn't necessarily see it as tied to these other questions like anti-imperialism and Palestinian solidarity and police abolition, labor solidarity, the tenants movement, feminism, etc., that they came to DSA with a more kind of personal investment in. But when this Bowman issue started to occur, people started to realize like, oh, like letting politicians who we've endorsed get away with this kind of behavior while representing our organization actually does have really fundamental political implications for the work that we do, its long-term viability, who it's going to appeal to, whether it belongs fundamentally to the working class and to the socialist movement, or whether it belongs to this kind of network of NGO professionals and politicians that have historically dominated left-wing politics in the United States, and set the agenda so that we, don't get too uppity about questions like Palestinian solidarity. And something that Joel also spoke to that we really tried to identify and leverage and push forward in this was the way that it was activating tons and tons and tons of rank and file members who don't see themselves as super plugged in or active, or like are in the caucuses and stuff like that. Though some caucuses played a role here. And we really tried to leverage this. Like the night that all of this was going down, we wrote this petition. A lot of people, if you like looked at Twitter or Facebook or just talked to some comrades in your chapter, a ton of people were like, I might quit DSA over this. I know people personally canceled their dues. And that's often what happens when we have these political struggles and we have nothing to rally around. It's just people in their ones and twos get demoralized and leave. So a big part of what we were trying to do with this proposal was give people a rallying point and a kind of unified set of politics to fight around. And so you'll see that beyond just the first two demands, which are specific demands placed on the NPC, we also talk about the end of the proposal in section 3, making kind of a collective commitment on our own part, not as the NPC who are placing demands on, but as all of us who signed, to struggle towards making DSA an organization that fights for a liberated and democratic Palestine and for anti-imperialist movements all over the world, and to begin preparing an opposition in DSA that can defend this kind of vision of international working class revolution and fight this kind of class collaboration with politicians like Bowman, going into the 2023 convention. So really setting a goal for all 1,300 and change of us to commit to, which is going to be hard because within this kind of broad, loose coalition that we have, there are a ton of political differences to hash out. There are going to be some bloody fights, I'm sure. It's going to be difficult to unify around a specific program for 2023. But if we don't do that and we enter as these kind of fragmented, tiny factions, all with our own separate proposals, I feel confident that even with the seeming majority of the membership we have behind us, we're still potentially able to squander that and lose to the right again. So really, I think this is just kind of the beginning of some difficult political work that we have to do with each other to begin building a real unified opposition with substantive and clear politics. I guess to finish the story of this petition, after its ginormous number of signatures, I think the rival petition that the right put out got something like 400 or 300. And we got a bunch of these chapters signing on, sick. We ended up getting at least one demand met of these first two, which was the reinstatement of the working group. To the best of my knowledge, this one, to lift the ban on national leadership placed on them, has not been met at this time. And the second demand for the NPC to affirm the right of lower bodies to criticize them politically also has not yet been met. But we got one win, and I think that we have the political clarity and the numbers to get more.
Thank you, Annie, for that summary. Yeah, I mean, I think if it wasn't clear in my opening statements, like, well, I try to cover procedural things so that people understand the timeline. This was definitely a politically motivated thing, right? Like this, the procedures and bylaws, or whatever you want to call it, were used to justify a political move. And there's no way to challenge what the NPC says besides things like the Foreign International Statement, like besides us asking them to not do it, right? And to me, regardless of their political, personal political views, 16 people cannot democratically represent 90,000 people. And we need that political dissent. The first question we have in the chat is, are you surprised that the biggest and most active debate in the org has been about the question of Palestine? Definitely not for me. I think the other people here probably have their own answers. I started organizing around Palestinian solidarity in 2008, and ever since then, every leftist space I've been in, this has been one of the top debate issues that has drawn lines in multiple organizations and organizing spaces I've been in. Right, understanding that Zionist propaganda is so strong in the United States, right? Like the American empire and imperialism to support Israel and create and support that state, and therefore the genocide against Palestinian people is so prevalent in our society that you can lose your job for speaking up for Palestine, even as a non-Palestinian person, right? Not even getting into the level of fear and intimidation that goes towards Palestinians in the United States. I have known people who have lost their job or have been harassed just for saying that they support Palestine, right? And we're seeing in the last few years a switch in the US left, where it is becoming more understood what is actually happening in Palestine and the struggle of the Palestinian people and our role as America in perpetrating that, right? So I think that this is a crucial question of our time. It's been a crucial question for the left for a long time. And I'm very excited that I'm unexcited that it has to be so much of a question, but I'm excited that it's finally getting the forefront and finally being a debate, and people are starting to understand what the actual political question is and why it is important for us to stand in solidarity with Palestine. I'm going to pass it over to Joel, maybe wants to take up this question.
Yeah, I think it's not too surprising. I think Palestine has, like Annie mentioned, has always been a litmus test for socialists to stand by our principles and always be with the oppressed and exploited, regardless of whether it's inconvenient or not. So I think, the phenomenon of people being progressive except Palestine, which a lot of people will have heard of, this is still a thing. I think that rumors of liberal Zionism being finished have been greatly exaggerated. Liberal Zionism is not gone. It's definitely still a thing. And I think that, when we look at some of the fundamental political rifts in the socialist movement around the question of like electoral expediency and, what's a principle that we can never compromise on or else undermine whatever movement we're trying to build, versus what's not a principle and what can we be flexible about. I think that things, when socialists take on the bourgeois state, when we take on the capitalist state, when we oppose war, when we oppose imperialism, when we take on racism, that's always been a problem for electoral expediency. I think that always presents us with situations like what we ran into, with Jamal Bowman, and I would argue, and I'm speaking for myself and not for the whole working group, I would argue definitely with AOC, with Bernie Sanders. Bernie, of course, for years has supported, an F-35 base in Vermont. He supported police. He opposes defunding the police. And, he has a poor stance on immigration. He, doesn't always support immigrants. And I just think that this has always been an Achilles heel of the perspective of trying to take shortcuts to building up the socialist movement. I think it's actually important to state we absolutely need strength in numbers. We actually do need to reach the working class, and we need to be growing the socialist movement by thousands, absolutely, and that's nothing to sneeze at. But it's also important to not redefine what socialism is and not help capitalists spread confusion. I think anybody who has done labor organizing is probably familiar with some of the ways that bosses disorganize workers, dividing workers against each other, promoting fear and intimidation, spreading confusing and distracting messages and muddying the waters. And one of the ways we can help them do that, one of the ways that we can help the capitalist class confuse the working class in the broader class struggle outside of the working place, is by muddying the waters on what socialism actually is and what we stand for the sake of short-term gains, for the sake of being able to say that we have more electeds in Congress. We're essentially painting the target around the arrow. We're just redefining success, and there's no point in doing that. So I think that that's one of the fundamental questions that's come up here. And it's always, and then yeah, getting back to the question, it's always Palestine. It seems that triggers that test. That is, that test of whether we're serious about solidarity with the oppressed or not. So, I think it makes a lot of sense that this was that it was Palestine that drew out these questions.
We have a question from Facebook, Leah on Facebook. Do you think a special convention should be called, and do you think the 9 should be recalled? I'm gonna say those 9 are the 9 members of the NPC that voted to decharter the working group for clarification. Does anyone want to? I mean, I have my answer, but I've given an answer already. Annie, do you have an answer specifically?
I'd say I'm uncharacteristically maybe a fence sitter on this particular question. I think a special convention with a very clear sense of purpose could be really valuable. And I think it would show a lot of leadership that they recently have not really shown on the NPC's part if they were willing to call one. I think more narrowly, at least, to fill the current vacant seats on the NPC, which I think there are 3. Via an election rather than appointment, which is the standard system, and I think is fine on paper, but in practice, most people I think recognize now that there's just incredibly little confidence in the current NPC majority. There would be a show of good faith on their part to call a special convention or some form of election. I think beyond that, I do worry that often when these issues come up, we all kind of look for like the most immediate organizational fix, or like I often see a lot of people who are like, well, in the Constitution, it says like do this thing or this thing. And in practice, I think it just burns a lot of energy from the most kind of technically minded of us. When now to me is really the time to begin preparing for the long haul, to begin doing kind of extensive political and agitational work, both within DSA and amongst each other, and also on our periphery and among our allies, trying to bring radical groups like the Palestinian Youth Movement and the Samadun Prisoner Solidarity Network that distance themselves from DSA more into not just DSA's orbit, but the left of DSA's orbit. And generally just begin kind of preparing a political movement for the long term so that we can begin taking back our organization once we're organized enough to do so, rather than hoping that if we get like the right organizational fix right now, that we can kind of like slide back in there without having to necessarily do the slow and patient work of building an opposition, arguably building a majority, since it seems like we may have that. But again, that's not to say that I'm against a special convention. I think it would be great if we had one. I just don't want us to kind of lose sight of the bigger political picture.
I mean, if I can jump in, I want to preface my answer here just to repeat that I'm not a member of the DSA anymore. I did go ahead and cancel my dues over this when NPC decharted the working group. And the other thing I'd throw out there to Leah's question, when it came to rechartering the working group and the question of the working group's leadership being reinstated, there's 7 remaining members of the NPC who have refused to reinstate the working group's leadership, which deadlocked NPC. It was a 7-7 split. A couple people have resigned from NPC as a result of this. So I think, I would agree with Annie that I think the fundamental question of what kind of org we want is the most important. And I think, what kind of org DSA members want, what kind of org the socialist movement needs. That seems to me the fundamental question. I think, a special convention could do that. I mean, it could be focused on actually these deeper questions, like, is this a socialist organization run by its members, or is this kind of an NGO in the orbit of the Democratic Party, in which members are essentially donors, and there's kind of a blurry line between a member who's participating in running the org and just somebody who's donating monthly dues. I think that when we look at some of how this controversy has played out, there are some members of the right faction of the NPC who have, suggested without a shred of evidence that this was some kind of COINTELPRO op, that the BDS working group represents some kind of effort by some feds to infiltrate DSA to wreck it. And then, of course, we're on a Tempest live stream. There's also been some extraordinary claims about some kind of Tempest conspiracy theory. I think that kind of behavior, obviously it's desperate. It's trying to change the subject from the political issue at stake and trying to ignore the rank and file support for the working group, and especially the multiple Palestinian-led grassroots orgs who have made really explicitly clear that they need to see the working group reinstated, and that they aren't going to work with the DSA until that happens. I just think that that kind of behavior is reprehensible, and it's going to be impossible to move forward and kind of reconcile fundamental conflicts in principle that have become like a knockdown, drag out fight. This isn't really like a debate between comrades at this point, and it's good to be honest about that. I did kind of want to flag some of those organizations, by the way. You have the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights is the umbrella org of Palestine solidarity orgs in the United States, and it's come out and said, yeah, we can't work with the DSA until the working group is reinstated. The Sami Doon Palestinian Prisoner Solidarity Network, National Students for Justice in Palestine, the Palestine Youth Movement, Palestiniat in Seattle, the Good Shepherd Collective. These are a few of the Palestinian-led orgs, and they're no slouches, obviously, in the Palestine Solidarity Movement. Who, if DSA is in solidarity with Palestinians and in solidarity with BDS, the org can't have its cake and eat it too. Can't say that you support Palestinians, but then ignore a pretty unequivocal demand from from all these groups. But so I think to the question, I think a special convention that focuses on what kind of org DSA wants to be, I think that makes a lot of sense.
I see we've got a bunch of other questions coming in, so I'll just briefly say, while I'm dropping a link in the chat to a link tree. I am very much for a call for a special convention. I don't think that I locally can fight for the type of relationship and work I want to do on the ground with Students for Justice in Palestine and Madison for Palestine, and be in the DSA and not make our organization change faster, right? Like, I want all the things that Annie said. Like, I want all those things. I want to do the long haul stuff. I want to do the education. I want to do the campaigns. I want to be committed to BDS, but I don't think I can look those organizations in the face and say, work with me, and trust that in a year and a half, we'll maybe hopefully fix this in DSA. Like, I think that the national leadership broke the faith I have in them, and that outside orgs have in the DSA, being a reliable partner, right? Being in their corner, being for the oppressed over supporting the imperialist party that is the Democrats, right? And so to me, it's crucial for my long-term organizing to make those calls in the DSA. Now, are we actually going to get to a special convention? Who knows? But I think we have to fight for it, especially for the people who are in DSA, who are on that fence, or who have just left over this issue, right? I don't want to lose those people for the long haul. If what we can do is fight together for a socialist society, right? Like, I think we do get claims. The BDS working group for sure got claims. And those of us that have been outspoken about this, about wanting to split DSA or change DSA, like, I don't want to split DSA. I want DSA to be bigger. I also want DSA to be accountable to its membership. And I think its membership is politically moving down the right track, like a track that I generally agree with. I think it's put out there that this is a minority position. I don't believe that it is. I believe that supporting BDS and Palestinian solidarity is the majority position of the membership of DSA. And I don't think that's been disproven by anyone in a leadership position at this point. But we have a lot of other questions coming in. So let's see, what is, we have a question from Alan on Facebook. What is the primary political concerns or motivations of the conservative members of the NBC, and what's your assessment that shaped their actions? So to me, it comes back to what I just said, which is an allegiance to the Democratic Party, right? It is this question of, Joel brought up earlier, what are we willing to shed in our principles along the way to have some conception of mass appeal. And to me, politically, it's just a fundamentally flawed question that we have to be more conservative to be more to have a greater mass appeal. I simply don't think that's true. I think standing up to our principles and explaining what our politics are as socialists actually has a broader appeal. And we all don't agree, right? Joel, Annie, and I, all on this call, we have different conceptions of what socialism is and what our priorities and where we spend our time working. And that's all fine as long as we can get together and debate and hash it out. Like that's the point, right? Is that we don't each, I don't personally have a perfect conception of what a good socialist society looks like. I get there through debate and work and conversation with my comrades as we shape what that future is together. So I think the political motivations were to keep us more in line with following the stars of DSA, right, and electeds, and falling in line with that electoral strategy. And then also just briefly touching on, you know, the propaganda that is the Israel PR machine is incredibly strong and persuasive. And if people don't understand the basic politics of like how Israel was created and like why we should be in solidarity with Palestine and what's actually happening, and they buy into the propaganda and the PR, it's easier to say, oh, there's a two-sided issue. Oh, this is really complex. Oh, I don't feel like I can weigh in on this. It's not my stance. But frankly, we do need to weigh in on it because we fund it. And that's a big issue. So I'll pass it over to Joel or Annie, whoever wants to take up either that question or another question.
On that question, one thing I will say is like, I mean, a common like kind of argument I've seen from the right within DSA on this issue is kind of like, oh, like how can you doubt the NPC's motivations? Like I know them personally sometimes, not, people making that argument. And like I know that they really truly believe in Palestinian liberation. I don't personally doubt that. I think that they absolutely thought that they were doing the best possible thing for Palestinian liberation. The problem is that most of us listening to this probably are Marxists, and we know that it's not just a question of the ideas that are in your head, but of how those ideas impact reality. And in this case, they follow a kind of political logic where the relationships that we have with, elected officials within the Democratic Party, kind of bureaucrats and professional activists within the nonprofit world, career sort of movement and community leaders are where our political power comes from, and where we could potentially leverage support for Palestinian liberation and other issues like it. I think that in practice, history has shown that for the most part, it has the opposite effect, where this kind of like network of Democratic Party and nonprofit officials pressures us more than we're able to pressure them. And the relationships that they build with us are not built in good faith. Bowman was talking about both sides of his mouth the whole time, telling Zionist groups that he supports them, telling anti-Zionist groups that he supports them. The whole system is playing with us. And fundamentally, as Marxists, or at least as socialists, I think that we need to stand by the fact that our political power and our base comes from the exploited and the oppressed, even when they don't have cool NGOs with nice branding or elected officials who proclaim themselves community leaders. And that can be really hard and scary. And I sympathize with the NPC because they're probably in rooms full of these kind of like elected nonprofit world fools, telling them that the best thing they can do for Palestine is to destroy their own Palestinian solidarity apparatus. But at the end of the day, it's our job to model a better kind of politics, and one that is really based in the struggles of the oppressed.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think to Alan's question, I think a lot of the reason for the conservative leadership of DSA and their motivation, I think, is it's good to read what people say and read what they say. I think it's clear that they view respecting the BDS picket line, I think they view as kind of a third rail. It's something that doesn't, in their view, it's not popular like other things are popular, and it's I think that they view it as being sectarian and reckless. And I think that their attitude towards the organization is that some of the more left-wing tendencies in the DSA, are in their view unserious and dangerous, and could this is a 501c3, and that has certain legal ramifications. I think again, to what Annie said, their vision for popularizing socialism is to just election harder, more Bernies, more AOCs, more Jamal Bowmans, and and I think that they're willing to to some degree they're willing to see people leaving over this for the sake of getting the direction for the DSA that they want. Yeah, I mean, I think there's an element of that. There's an element of wanting to burn down the org for the sake of restoring it to what it was before 2016. If there's, it's a lot ironic, better, fewer, but better, I think, in their view, from a right-wing perspective. And like, if we've got less members, but we have a little more centralism and cohesion around a vision of electoral expediency, I think that for them that's better. And yeah, I did want to just mention really quick, I don't think we're going to have time to get to all the questions, but we're looking forward to having more spaces to have these conversations with more of the groups that are involved. But I'll leave it there.
Yes, yeah, we're going to be wrapping up in about 15-ish minutes, so we're going to get to a couple more questions. I mean, all of these questions are great, and obviously this is an ongoing discussion that we should be having regardless of this crisis in DSA, right? We should be having the conversation of Palestinian solidarity and how do we achieve that. So we do have a question from Kim. Does the elected leadership's positions on so many issues mean that the org can grow towards a revolutionary movement? Is the Revolutionary Socialist Organization the goal? And can we win Palestinian liberation without a revolution here or there? I don't know that I have the perfect answer to that question. That's a huge question, but I think that to the point of do we build the revolutionary organization, I think that the starting point is to no longer fund Israel with military aid, and to really tackle, like, for us to, from my perspective, it is not my job or place to tell Palestine, or Palestinians, what they need or what they can do or how they are going to achieve liberation. It's my job to support the calls that Palestinians are making, and the calls are for BDS, right? That's like the main call from Palestinian activists to the U.S., right? To us, is that we're funding the occupation directly. So it is our job to boycott, divest, and sanction, and to get our local organizations to do that, our schools to do that, our government to do that. And that's the organizing I'm going to do around that. Does that lead to a revolution? I mean, in an active war zone, what is a revolution? I don't know what that means for them, but for us locally in America, I am a revolutionary socialist. I do not think the U.S. has to go through a revolution to support Palestinian solidarity, right? I would love to see the U.S. fundamentally change the way it exists. But I think revolution is a giant term that can incorporate many different strategies. So to me, it's about pushing forward that, regardless of the work I'm going to do in DSA to push for a more democratic representative and the left-wing side of DSA. Aside from that, I will always be an activist for Palestinian solidarity, regardless of whether or not I'm a DSA member. And I think that pushing forward that education is crucial on the left in general. I will pass off to Joel and Annie, and they can also pick up one of the other questions if you want to. We're getting a bunch here. Maybe Joel can answer what kind of strategizing has happened between Tempest, the working group, and Palestinian orgs. I am not part of any of those discussions at the moment. So for reinstatement and bigger structural changes in DSA.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to speak a little to that. I mean, I think the short answer is more strategizing and more conversation needs to happen. And I think, again, to something Annie mentioned, that the more that we can get some cohesion and a conversation happening, the better. Definitely the working group has been in touch with, with groups that have supported it, whether they're, chapters like Madison or, caucuses or caucus-like orgs. So like, yeah, obviously including Tempest, AfroSoc, DSA Muslims, Marxist Unity, and then also with Palestine Solidarity org. So we're in a constant conversation with certainly like the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, the Palestinian Youth Movement, National Students for Justice in Palestine. And I think that the more that we're able to collaborate and facilitate those conversations, the better. The more, I especially think the more that we engage, rank and file members of each of these groups, and of the working group and of the DSA, and it not be small conversations between elected leaderships, the better. The more that we have a conversation about strategy that that involves, broader layers of people, the better. So, I will go ahead and share, the working group put out a few short-term things that people can do to support. I'm going to put this in, put this to the Tempest folks running this, and hopefully they can just share this on the live stream. Great, I'm hearing from them that they're able to do that. And, I think it includes signing on to the working group statement, rejecting the decision, and, people organizing their own chapters for, for statements supporting the working group, emailing the NPC. But then longer term, the bigger questions, I think, is a conversation that still has to happen. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Great. We're gonna take one last question, which is, do you think DSA is capable of healing the rift between itself and the Palestinian freedom movement? Annie, do you want to start this one off?
That's a big question. So I think that that's ultimately a collective question for all of us to start answering in practice. And it's not one that anyone in DSA or in the Palestinian freedom movement, I think, already knows the answer to. I think that the NPC has broken a huge amount of trust between our organization as a whole and the Palestinian movement, and particularly the left wing of the Palestinian movement, which I think is something that sometimes gets brushed under the rug. We're not just talking about a monolith Palestinian organization that all have the same views. We're talking about a huge range of political groups and individuals, all with their own politics and relationships with other organizations. And the groups that, apologies for my cat meowing, the groups that have pledged not to work with DSA are largely some of the most radical, some of the most socialist, and some of the most working class Palestinian liberation organizations. And it's pretty seriously harmful to our organization that we can't work with them as a collective. I do think there's a really strong spark of hope in the kind of political alignment of the left wing of DSA, groups like Tempest, like Marxist Unity, like Communist Caucus, and many, many individuals who are not in a caucus or whatever, but signed this petition or fought in some way to defend the BDS working group, and this wing of the Palestinian movement. And I think those are relationships that we need to begin building directly. If not as DSA, then as our caucuses or as ourselves, to really kind of bring the left of DSA and the left of the Palestinian movement closer together. That to me is a huge central task of the work that we have ahead of us. And as I said before, it's something that we're going to figure out in practice. We're not going to know until we try. There are probably going to be more bumps in the road, but I, despite everything, am more optimistic about the rank and file of DSA and its political potential than I have ever been. Even if I'm pretty heartbroken by sort of formal structure of DSA and its leadership.
Joel?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a tough question because I think that there's an irreconcilable conflict inside the DSA. So I think what I think supporters of Palestinian liberation should be focusing on, I think, is actually, recommitting our energy to grassroots BDS campaigns, because I do think that electoral expediency has taken a toll on that a little bit, and some of the momentum that we had, prior to 2016, with successful student divestment campaigns, real actual divestments of church endowment funds, building labor solidarity, that's continued to a degree. And of course, last May we had these incredible block the vote victories, and other working class and grassroots action. But I think that we need to be refocusing on that. And I think that, what's part of what's been incredibly frustrating about this entire crisis has been that we're having to kind of, fight supposedly our comrades on the left about even respecting the picket line, about even respecting the BDS picket line. And, what's actually happening in Palestine right now, right? I mean, just a few days ago, Israel killed yet another 3 Palestinians in the West Bank. In the besieged Gaza Strip, a very young child died of a treatable illness after Israel denied her and her family passage out of the Strip to access healthcare. And with Ramadan going on, we know that every Ramadan, Israel seizes the opportunity to escalate its violence and then blame Palestinians for defending themselves. So BDS campaigns are urgently needed, and I think that there is actually potential for growing the BDS movement in the United States, and especially working on the beginnings that we have of working class solidarity with Palestine. Not the least of which is through labor unions like teachers unions that have taken up BDS resolutions, dock workers, United Electrical, academic unions. These are our starting places, and I think that that's a big part of the question of what's next, what's the way forward. I think is for the left and for the socialist movement to reorient towards grassroots BDS campaigns and get us closer to the point where we can win an end to U.S. military funding for Israel, where we can make it so that actually you can't masquerade as any kind of progressive politician and vote one single time for a single penny for Israeli weapons.
Yes, all of that. I mean, I think personally, I wouldn't still be in DSA if I didn't think there was a path forward that led to reconciliation of this issue. And that's what I'm fighting for, right? That's why I'm staying in the org, and that's why I'm fighting, is because I believe that we can, as an organization, reach a turning point and rebuild that trust. But that takes time and it takes actions, right? It's not like the rechartering of the BDS working group with the continued suspension of the leadership was not the retrust building move, right? And it takes time, and it takes DSA putting skin in the game to actually stand up for Palestinian rights and for the BDS picket line when they have something to lose, something we would consider another losing organization, before I think that trust can really rebuild, right? We can talk about it all we want, but unless the majority of the organization or the leadership of the organization will actually put skin in the game and vote and move towards following our own political platform that we voted in on convention, right? The convention, the general membership of DSA voted to support BDS, and we voted to have the BDS working group for a reason, because it's a priority for members. And so I believe if we're able to get back to that and we're able to support that and show that time will allow those relationships to rebuild. I hope, right? Because DSA is the largest socialist organization in the country, and that's why I joined it, because we do need that mass movement. But we only need that mass movement if it is actually going to be a mass movement for oppressed people and for the working class, right? And I think that we have a chance to have that debate and to win it out in the organization. But we're almost at time for tonight. So thank you so much for everyone for joining us, for asking questions. We're going to do a last little round of sort of like next steps of what people are up to next. So let's start with Annie.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you to the Tempest crew for putting this on. It's very lovely speaking with y'all. Um, I think in terms of next steps, for folks listening, it's imperative just to keep these political conversations happening, keep reaching out to folks in your networks and your chapters, the outside organizations you work with, continue to kind of build this cohesion. It's going to get hard as we kind of lose the immediate momentum of like, oh, there's a crisis and we're all going to fight around it. And there are going to be days where you're going to be like, I don't know if people still give a shit. But the more that we prepare, educate folks, argue and hash out issues amongst ourselves, and organize for a stronger DSA and a stronger Palestinian solidarity movement, the better of a position that will be in the long run. So I encourage folks to just get cracking. I will also plug quickly. I really wish I had a date for this, but unfortunately we don't have one hashed out yet. But the authors of the petition, in collaboration with Cosmonaut, who have offered to host us, are going to be putting on a forum on building an internationalist opposition within DSA at some point within the next month or two. So everyone should keep an eye out for the announcement about that.
Awesome. Joel, what next steps? I know you shared some for the BDS working group. You want to re-echo those and whatever other follow-ups you have.
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate everyone who took the time to watch this live stream or who, who's watching it recorded afterwards. And yeah, I mean, appreciate the folks organizing it for bringing me on. And I do just think, yeah, I mean, next steps, definitely people can click that link, that Medium link for short-term ways to support the working group. In the long term, I think that creating, the forum for an internationalist opposition in the DSA, it's also a really positive step. And I would say, yeah, just to reiterate, we got to get back to grassroots BDS campaigns. I think that that's the way forward. Let's boycott Israel until Palestinians have their self-determination and equal rights.
Heck yes. I am gonna post the link I posted again for the connection to the link tree for a call for a special convention. So Madison DSA as a general membership voted last Wednesday to call for a special election. And in that, one of our points in the resolution is that Wisconsin is one of 32 states in the United States where it is illegal to boycott, divest, or sanction Israel, right? 32 of the 50 states in the United States, it is against the law to boycott Israel. So to Joel's point earlier, like when I'm fighting this fight, I don't want to have to be fighting my comrades about it. There's enough people we need to be fighting, right? And they sit in the Capitol buildings of our states and our national country. And like, those are the people we want to bring the fight to. And that's going to happen through grassroots BDS organizing, all of the work that the working group is doing, and other people. And I'm very excited for that work and going to continue that work. So those are the next steps for me. As an organizer, and then as a member of DSA, next steps are really calling for a vote of no confidence in the NPC, right? That this leadership needs to acknowledge that they made a gigantic political misstep, and they need to be accountable to that. Just like they are holding any member accountable, they need to hold themselves accountable. And I know earlier we had a question about should the 9 be recalled. That's a great question. We can't actually recall our leadership in the DSA, and so they would have to volunteer to step down. So my next step is to fight for a special convention in DSA, and the other next step is just to continue grassroots organizing, and then I'm going to make a pitch for reading Palestine: A Socialist Introduction, put out by Haymarket Book. Educate yourselves. Follow Palestinians on Instagram and see what's actually happening in Palestine. Follow news sources that's outside of the U.S. Like I'm sure the BDS, if you go to working group, if you go to their site, have educational resources. They put on a film event yesterday. Like there's lots of ways to educate yourself about this issue if you don't feel confident in your knowledge base already, and then organize. So thank you, Joel. Thank you, Annie, for jumping on tonight. This was a great conversation. I look forward to continuing to work with everyone on this topic.
Thanks, everybody.